What if I told you that one of Hollywood's biggest stars, a man who filled theaters around the world, who made studios hundreds of millions of dollars, who was beloved by virtually everyone who met him, was quietly erased? Not fired, not canceled, erased. No announcement, no explanation, just silence. The phone stopped ringing, the auditions dried up, and the man who once outran mummies in the Sahara Desert was left to quietly fall apart, alone, broke, and in physical agony, while the world assumed he had simply faded away. His name is Brendan Fraser. And for nearly 20 years, that's exactly what Hollywood wanted you to believe. But here's the question nobody was asking at the time. Why does a man at the absolute peak of his career, with a global fan base, a franchise worth $500 million, and genuine talent, suddenly disappear? Bad luck? Poor choices? Or something far darker? Because what actually happened to Brendan Fraser isn't a story about box office flops or bad management. It's a story about power, about silence, about what happens when you cross the wrong man in a town where a handful of people control everything: your reputation, your career, your future. And it starts at a lunch in Beverly Hills in 2003, where one moment would cost Brendan Fraser 2 decades of his life. Before we get there, and trust me, we will get there, you need to understand exactly how powerful the people involved really were. Because without that context, the rest of this story won't make sense. The hero before the fall. To understand how devastating Brendan Fraser's fall truly was, you first need to understand how high he had climbed. Fraser broke into Hollywood in the early 1990s with a kind of effortless charm that the industry hadn't seen in a long time. He wasn't brooding. He wasn't trying to be the next Marlon Brando. He was just likable. Genuinely, disarmingly likable. And in a town full of carefully manufactured personas, that was actually rare. His early roles told you everything about the kind of actor he wanted to be. In Encino Man, he played a defrosted caveman navigating suburban life, absurd, physical, and completely committed. In School Ties, he held his own alongside a young Matt Damon and Ben Affleck in a serious dramatic film about identity and anti-Semitism. 2 completely different films, to 2 completely different registers. And Fraser handled both with ease. Then came George of the Jungle, a Disney parody of Tarzan that, on paper, sounded like career suicide. But Fraser leaned into it completely, and audiences loved him for it. The film made 3 times its production budget. Studios took notice. But it was The Mummy that changed everything. Released in 1999, The Mummy was a massive, globe-trotting action adventure where Fraser played Rick O'Connell, a treasure hunter equal parts reckless and heroic. It was the kind of role that required everything: physical endurance, comic timing, dramatic range, and the ability to anchor an enormous production without losing the audience's trust for a single frame. And Fraser delivered, completely. What most people didn't know, and what Fraser rarely talked about publicly, was just how much that performance cost him. Filming took place partly in the Sahara Desert, where the cast and crew endured weeks of brutal isolation, relentless heat, and sandstorms so severe they would shut down production entirely. Fraser pushed through all of it. But the moment that truly defines what kind of performer Brendan Fraser was, and what the industry was willing to do to get what it wanted, happened during the filming of an execution scene near the beginning of the film. The scene required Fraser to be hanged. A mock hanging, of course, controlled, with safety measures in place. But the director wanted realism. He wanted the tension in Fraser's face to be authentic. so he asked for another take. And then he asked for the rope to be tightened. Fraser had a gut feeling. He knew something was wrong, but he said yes anyway, because that's what you did. You didn't question the director. You didn't push back. You surrendered yourself to the process, or you risked never working again. What happened next was terrifying. The rope tightened, the camera rolled, and Brendan Fraser lost consciousness on set. His doctors later told him he had been technically dead for between 12 and 14 seconds. 12 to 14 seconds. He came back. He finished the film. And when he went on David Letterman to promote The Mummy, he turned the whole story into a joke, deflecting with humor, making the audience laugh, never once letting them see how close it had actually come. That moment, choosing to protect the production over his own safety, then choosing to protect his image over his own trauma, tells you more about Brendan Fraser than any interview ever could. He was the kind of man who swallowed the hard things and kept moving. The Mummy was released in May 1999 and became a global phenomenon. Made for roughly $80 million, it earned nearly $500 million at the worldwide box office. Fraser was suddenly one of the most bankable stars on the planet. The sequel, The Mummy Returns, performed just as well. His personal life appeared equally strong. He was married to actress Afton Smith and had started a family. From the outside, Brendan Fraser had everything. But here's what nobody talks about. The Mummy franchise was destroying his body in real time. Every stunt, every physical sequence, every take where he pushed past the point of safety was accumulating into something irreversible. He started building what he called an exoskeleton just to get through production days. Ice packs, compression gear, padding hidden under his costumes. He was falling apart while the cameras were rolling, and nobody in the studio system seemed particularly concerned. Because studios don't care about your body. They care about the footage. And that dynamic, the expectation that Fraser would give everything and ask for nothing in return, was about to extend far beyond the set. Brendan Fraser survived a near-death experience on set, rebuilt himself physically, and delivered one of the biggest box office hits of his generation. So what on earth could bring a man like that to his knees? And keep watching, because the answer involves one of the most powerful and corrupt organizations Hollywood has ever produced. To understand what happened to Brendan Fraser after 2003, you need to understand one organization. An organization that most people outside of Hollywood had never heard of, and that those inside Hollywood were very careful never to criticize: the Hollywood Foreign Press Association. On the surface, it sounded harmless enough. A group of international journalists based in Los Angeles, covering the entertainment industry for non-American markets. They had been around since 1943. 1 year after forming, they created their own award show, a little ceremony called the Golden Globes. For decades, nobody took it particularly seriously. The Academy Awards were the real prize. The Golden Globes were just a dinner party with trophies. Then NBC picked them up in the late 1980s, and everything changed. Ratings climbed, viewership exploded, and suddenly, winning a Golden Globe wasn't just a nice footnote in a press kit. It was a career-defining moment. Studios realized that a Globe nomination could transform a mid-budget film into an awards season contender. A win could mean tens of millions of additional dollars at the box office. The timing of the ceremony, weeks before Oscar nominations, made it the perfect launching pad for an entire awards campaign. And whoever controlled the Golden Globes controlled the momentum of Hollywood itself. That control sat with roughly 90 journalists, 90 people who could be wined, dined, flattered, and quietly paid, and whose votes could make or break a film, a performance, or an entire career. Here's what I want you to think about for a second. 90 people. That's it. 90 journalists holding the fate of a multi-billion-dollar industry in their hands. Does that seem like a system designed for fairness or for manipulation? Because the manipulation was not subtle. Studios began allocating serious money specifically to court members of the association. Publicists were paid to steer clients down the pre-show red carpet in ways that maximized member exposure. Consultants charged studios up to $45,000 just for advice on how to work the room. Bonuses of $20,000 were paid if a film scored a nomination, $30,000 more if it won, and the favors ran deeper than money. Actors would socialize with members at private events, making them feel valued, interesting, important. Because at the end of the day, these were journalists, not power brokers. And when a movie star sits down next to you and makes you feel like the most fascinating person in the room, your vote tends to reflect that feeling. This was the machine. Methodical, invisible, and almost entirely unaccountable. At the center of it, for much of its most powerful era, was a man named Philip Burke. He had been a member of the association for 33 years. He served as president for 8 separate terms. He was the kind of man who stayed deliberately out of the spotlight, which in Hollywood is its own kind of power move. The less visible you are, the harder you are to attack. Burke didn't need to be famous. He just needed to be feared. And the story of what happened to journalist Nick Douglas proved exactly why people feared him. Nick Douglas was a member of the association and a writer for a small entertainment publication. In 2004, he was suspended from the organization, not for anything dramatic, but for 2 violations that, in any normal workplace, would barely register. First, he sold a photograph of himself with an actor to a tabloid for $50. Members weren't allowed to profit from the access the association provided. Second, he was accused of taking unopened beers from a studio reception, $50 and a few free drinks. For that, Nick Douglas was cut off from every press junket, every celebrity interview, every professional opportunity that flowed through the association's network. In a single administrative decision, his entire livelihood was eliminated. 4 days before the Golden Globe nominations were announced the following year, Nick Douglas was found dead. His editor-in-chief did not hold back when asked for comment, stating clearly that the association had taken away a man's livelihood, and that this had led directly to what happened to Nick. When Philip Burke was asked about the connection between Douglas's suspension and his death, his response was cold and brief. He acknowledged that the association had suspended people before for actions deemed harmful to the organization. He said he didn't believe there was a causal relationship between the suspension and Douglas's death. Not a word of regret, not a moment of reflection, just an organization protecting its image. And that, right there, is the world Brendan Fraser was navigating when he attended a luncheon at the Beverly Hills Hotel in 2003. A world where the wrong enemy could end your career with a phone call. Where the rules existed to protect those in power, not those beneath them. Where silence was the only safe option. Brendan Fraser didn't know it yet, but he was about to become the most high-profile example of what happened when someone threatened the wrong man. An organization that could silence a journalist over $50 and free beer. Now imagine what they were willing to do to protect themselves from a global movie star with a very serious allegation. What would you do if you were Brendan Fraser in that moment? Stay silent or fight back? Keep watching. It was the summer of 2003. Brendan Fraser was at the absolute peak of his career. 2 Mummy films, a global fan base, a family he loved, a future that looked, from every possible angle, completely secure. He attended a luncheon at the Beverly Hills Hotel, the kind of industry event that stars at his level were expected to show up to, shake hands at, and move through gracefully. It was a gathering connected to the association. Philip Burke was there. As Fraser was leaving, he crossed paths with Burke. He extended his hand for what he expected to be a routine goodbye. A handshake. The kind of thing you do 100 times at events like this without thinking about it. What happened next was not a handshake. According to Fraser, Burke reached around him, grabbed his body, and touched him in a way that was unmistakably deliberate, invasive, violating. Fraser described the moment in detail years later, recalling exactly how it felt. The physical sensation, the immediate confusion, the instinct to pull away. He said he felt like a little kid. He said there was a ball in his throat. He thought he was going to cry. He described feeling like someone had thrown invisible paint on him, like something had been placed on his body that he couldn't wash off. He left the event. He didn't go to the police. He didn't call his publicist. He didn't post anything publicly. He drove away from the Beverly Hills Hotel, carrying something heavy and shapeless, trying to make sense of what had just happened to him. That night, he told his wife, Afton. And then, for a long time, he told almost no one else. And think about that for a moment. A man at the height of his power, physically imposing, globally famous, surrounded by an industry that claimed to celebrate him, and he still felt he had no safe place to go with what had happened. What does that tell you about the system he was operating inside? Fraser's representatives did eventually reach out to the association on his behalf. They asked for something simple, an apology. Not a lawsuit. Not a public statement. Just an acknowledgement that what Burke had done was wrong. What they got back was a masterclass in institutional non-accountability. Burke's written response admitted no wrongdoing. The language was careful and hollow. Something along the lines of, "If anything I did caused offense, it was unintended, and I apologize for that. If anything, I did caused offense, not, I was wrong. A not, I'm sorry for what I did." A conditional apology that managed to say nothing while appearing to say something. The kind of language written specifically to protect the person giving it. The association separately reached out to Fraser's team and made a promise. He would never be required to be in the same room as Philip Burke again. Burke himself later denied that any such promise was made. The organization refused to comment. And then the silence began. It didn't happen overnight. These things never do. But the roles started thinning. The callbacks slowed. The starring vehicles that should have followed the success of the Mummy franchise simply didn't materialize. Fraser kept working. A supporting role in the Oscar-winning film Crash. Guest appearances in television. A third Mummy film that underperformed its predecessors. But the trajectory had reversed. For years, Fraser couldn't fully understand why. That's one of the cruelest things about being blacklisted. Nobody tells you. There's no meeting, no letter, no official explanation. The industry just quietly reroutes around you. Doors that used to open automatically now stay shut, and you're left standing in the hallway wondering what you did wrong. Fraser later described this period as trying to move through fog. He was still showing up, still working, still trying to be the professional he had always been. But something essential had been taken from him, not just professionally, but internally. The assault had destabilized something deep. He found himself becoming more reclusive, more withdrawn, and less able to connect with the version of himself that had walked onto those sets with complete confidence. He described battling depression. He talked about memory issues, long stretches of time that became hazy and indistinct as his mind tried to process something it couldn't fully categorize. He kept working because he had a family to support and because stopping entirely felt like surrender. But the spark that had made him so magnetic on screen was dimming in ways that were becoming visible to anyone paying attention. Meanwhile, his body continued to deteriorate from years of physical punishment on set. Multiple spinal surgeries, a partial knee replacement, vocal cord repair. He spent the better part of 7 years moving in and out of hospitals. Spending money he was increasingly struggling to earn on procedures to fix damage that the industry had helped create, and then walked away from entirely. The man who had survived a near hanging in the Sahara Desert, who had built an exoskeleton just to keep filming, who had swallowed every hard thing without complaint, was quietly being dismantled, piece by piece, in private. And the worst part? Hollywood wasn't watching. It had already moved on. Brendan Fraser lost nearly 2 decades to silence, pain, and isolation. But here's what I haven't told you yet. The man responsible didn't just get away with it. He actually wrote about it, in a book, under his own name. And that decision would ultimately cost him everything. Stay with me. By the early 2010s, Brendan Fraser had become something the entertainment press loved to reduce to a punchline. There was a photo, taken at what Fraser himself would later describe as one of his lowest moments, that began circulating online under the label "Sad Brendan Fraser." Sloped shoulders, vacant eyes, a man who looked like he was carrying something invisible and crushing. The internet found it funny. They turned it into a meme. They shared it millions of times. Nobody stopped to ask why he looked that way, because asking that question would have required a level of curiosity and empathy that celebrity culture, at its worst, simply doesn't offer. Fraser wasn't a person in that moment to the people sharing that image. He was a punchline, a cautionary tale about faded glory, a reminder that Hollywood chews people up. What they didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was exactly who had done the chewing. Then Philip Burke made a decision that can only be described as staggeringly arrogant. He wrote a memoir. The book was called With Signs and Wonders, and in it, Burke detailed his decades at the helm of the association with the kind of openness that suggested he had never once considered that accountability might come for him. He wrote about the organization's inner workings. He addressed controversies. He was, by all accounts, remarkably candid for a man whose entire power depended on secrecy. And then, almost incomprehensibly, he wrote about Brendan Fraser. Burke's version of the 2003 incident was framed as a clarification. He claimed that during a conversation at the luncheon, the topic of a separate incident had come up. A rumor that Fraser had pinched a female association president at a prior Golden Globes ceremony. Burke said that to demonstrate how minor and misunderstood such contact could be, he reached over and pinched Fraser's body. To demonstrate. He pinched a man without consent, without warning. To demonstrate that pinching someone without consent wasn't a serious act. The circular logic was breathtaking. Burke wasn't defending himself so much as accidentally confessing in print, apparently unaware that what he was describing, touching someone's body without permission to prove a point about touching someone's body without permission, was not the exoneration he thought it was. But here's the thing about timing. When Burke's memoir was published, the cultural machinery that would eventually process this confession simply wasn't in place yet. The book received limited attention. The passage about Fraser was noted in a few entertainment publications and then largely forgotten. Burke was not a famous man. His readership was not large, and the industry had spent years training people to look away from exactly this kind of story. So here's the question I want you to sit with. How many people in Hollywood knew about Burke's confession and said nothing? How many read that passage, understood exactly what it meant, and decided it wasn't their problem? The answer, almost certainly, is a lot. But the world was about to change, and it would change faster than anyone, especially Philip Burke, was prepared for. And the year 2017 brought the full weight of the Me Too movement into public consciousness. Investigative reporting exposed Harvey Weinstein, the same Harvey Weinstein who had spent years cultivating and legitimizing the association, as a serial predator whose behavior had been an open secret in Hollywood for decades. The story broke something open. Survivors who had been silent for years began to speak. The industry's architecture of silence and complicity was suddenly, for the first time, being examined in public daylight. For Brendan Fraser, watching this unfold was complicated and deeply personal. He later spoke about seeing women he knew, people he considered friends, colleagues, members of his professional world, standing up and telling their stories with a courage he hadn't yet found in himself. He watched the movement grow and felt something shift inside him. By 2018, he was ready. In a private conversation with a journalist from GQ, conducted significantly while Fraser was caring for his horse, far from the performance spaces of Hollywood, he told the full story for the first time. The luncheon, Burke, the assault, the non-apology, the silence, the fog that had followed him for 15 years. He spoke quietly and carefully, the way people speak when they've held something for a very long time and are finally, cautiously, setting it down. He talked about not knowing whether what happened to his career was directly connected to Burke and the association. He acknowledged that blacklisting is designed to be invisible. No one calls you to announce it. But he described the silence that followed the incident as deafening. A word chosen carefully by a man who understood exactly what silence in Hollywood meant. He talked about the Me Too movement and the people who had inspired him to speak. He was characteristically humble, deflecting credit, insisting that others had been far more courageous than he was. But make no mistake, what Brendan Fraser did in that interview took real courage. He was naming a powerful man. He was describing an assault. He was doing it without a legal team staging the disclosure, without a publicist managing the narrative, without any guarantee that anyone would believe him. He just told the truth. After 15 years of carrying it alone, Philip Burke's public response was as cold as everything else he had ever said. Fraser's career, Burke stated, had declined through no fault of the association. The industry, however, was listening differently now. Brendan Fraser finally told the truth. But telling the truth and being believed are two very different things, especially in Hollywood. So what actually happened next? Did the industry stand behind him? Did Burke face any consequences? And how does a man rebuild 20 years of lost time? The answer is coming, and it's more powerful than you might expect. The response to Fraser's interview was immediate and overwhelming. Fans who had grown up watching him sprint through ancient tombs and swing through jungle canopies suddenly understood why he had disappeared. Colleagues who had worked with him spoke up in support. The entertainment press, the same press that had turned his lowest moment into a meme, pivoted almost overnight. The narrative around Brendan Fraser didn't just change. It reversed completely. And slowly, carefully, the work started coming back. He began with voice acting, lending his voice to Robot Man in Doom Patrol, a character who had been through catastrophic physical trauma and was learning, painfully and imperfectly, how to exist inside a body that no longer felt like his own. It was a small role, but it was a beginning. Then came The Whale. Directed by Darren Aronofsky and based on a celebrated stage play, The Whale told the story of Charlie, a 600-pound English teacher living in isolation, estranged from his daughter, spending his final days trying to make amends for the ways he felt he had failed the people he loved most. Charlie refused to show his face on camera during his online classes. He was ashamed of what he had become. He existed behind closed doors, hidden from a world he no longer felt worthy of. When Fraser read the script, something in it connected to him on a level that went far beyond craft. He had spent nearly 2 decades behind his own closed doors. He knew what it felt like to be ashamed of the distance between who you were and who you used to be. He knew what it meant to carry weight, physical, emotional, how invisible, that the outside world couldn't see. He knew what it cost to finally decide to stop hiding. The performance Fraser delivered in The Whale was unlike anything he had ever done. No action sequences, no charm as a shield. Just a man, completely exposed, reaching for connection in the time he had left. When the film premiered at the Venice Film Festival in September 2022, the audience gave Brendan Fraser a 6-minute standing ovation. He wept. Not the composed, photogenic tears of an awards acceptance speech. Real tears. The kind that come when something that has been held under enormous pressure for an enormous amount of time is finally, irrevocably released. And then, on March 12, 2023, Brendan Fraser won the Academy Award for Best Actor. In his acceptance speech, he described his 30 years in the industry. He talked about how things hadn't come easily. He spoke about a time when the facility he had, the ease, the instinct, the joy of performing, had stopped. He described it as being on a diving expedition at the bottom of the ocean, with the airline to the surface, held by the people who loved him most. His sons were in the audience. Meanwhile, the machine that had silenced him was dismantling itself in real time. Philip Burke was expelled from the association in 2021 following racially insensitive comments that finally gave the organization's board sufficient public pressure to act. The association itself was dissolved in 2023. The Golden Globes were sold to new ownership. The organization that had operated as Hollywood's shadow government for decades simply ceased to exist in the form that had made it so dangerous. No dramatic trial, no public reckoning proportional to the damage caused, just a quiet institutional collapse. Which is, perhaps, the most Hollywood ending possible for a Hollywood villain. But Brendan Fraser's ending was something different entirely. He didn't win because Hollywood decided to be generous. He didn't come back because the industry felt guilty. He came back because he found a role that demanded every scar he had accumulated over 20 years. And he gave it everything he had left. That's not a comeback story. That's something rarer and harder. That's survival turned into art. Brendan Fraser spent 20 years being silenced by a system designed to protect the powerful. And in the end, he outlasted all of them. So, I want to ask you something. Do you think Hollywood has actually changed? Or is the same machine still running, just under a different name? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every single one. And if stories like this, the ones that go deeper than the headlines, the ones that actually matter, are what brought you here, then make sure you're subscribed to Elementor. Every week, we tell the stories that deserve to be told. I'll see you in the next one.